Everyone. I always like doing these presentations in person a lot more, but these days, I guess I drive a diesel truck at $5.49 a gallon. The more we do these, the more money we save. It's kind of crazy. And I think, that's going to affect everything, including vegetables. If you're used to going to the store or buying vegetables, I think you're going to see, if you hadn't already, the price is going to go up. A lot of that directly as a result of fuel prices. And so, as master gardeners, you probably already have some sense of a knowledge of growing your own vegetables. I think there's a number of reasons to do it. But for me, I mean, I've been doing it for 40 years. I think it's just I enjoy the quality, the flavor, and the challenge of doing it. And so today, in the short time we have, it might be a little bit of a review, but we'll look at some of the more important things as we enter the spring here, what you should be looking for in your home vegetable garden. Certainly the weather, we're going to talk about, it's kind of key. If you looked at the weather at all, it's pretty mild out right now, but we're going to drop down into the 20s or maybe even less if you're up in North Georgia. And that's pretty severely cold, particularly on vegetables. So, you might have some winter vegetables out right now that are going to hopefully make it through there. Certainly it's a little bit early to plant the spring garden, but there are some things that we need to kind of consider. So I'm going to have Miss Sarah's going to be my clicker. So when I say next, we'll just advance to the next slide. And Sarah, go ahead and we'll go to the next one if you don't mind. So I know you've seen this before, but I think it's important to really get an idea of what you want to grow. If it's your first time gardening with vegetables, or maybe you're a seasoned veteran like myself, sometimes it gets a little obscure of, hey, what really worked last year? What was a dud? How much of it did I have? And did I waste a lot? So, coming up with a good consensus of how much you need in the way of seed or transplants. Certainly right now is a good time to order seed. Like everything in this world right now, there's been a little bit of shortages. So some of the varieties that you would really like to get, you might have trouble finding. In fact, we've run into that several times on some of our trials. So you may have to, kind of look at different websites. We go to and that's what we do. We order a lot of stuff online. Nothing against the general garden centers and the feed stores, but many times they have some really limited selection of either transplants or seeds. And by going online, we can sort of choose some of the ones we'd really like to try or some that we feel are much improved. I order a lot of seed from Harris Seed, Harris. We buy stuff from Jung, Jung, Burpee Seed, Johnny Seed, just to name a few. Of course, everybody's familiar with Park Seed, and occasionally we'll get something from them. But you really want to have a garden plan, not only so that you can, figure out where things were planted, and that's important because we're familiar maybe with crop rotation, keeping things planted in a different area, families planted in a different area of the garden each year to try to help a little bit to break that soil disease cycle. But also keeping good records in case we forget where a variety was or what really performed well, like we mentioned earlier. It's good knowledge to have down the road. Okay, next. So some of you folks may have grown transplants before, and you're thinking, well, I've already seen the transplants sitting at Home Depot and Walmart and all the different garden centers. It must be too late to do so. No, really, those that are sitting out there right now are probably going to get bombshelled this weekend. It's not too late to grow transplants from seed. Certainly, you can do it. It's not a difficult process, and you can save a ton of money doing it. It also gets back to what we mentioned a minute ago, that you can kind of control the varieties that you want. Bonnie's Plant Farm does a good job. They're over in Alabama. They pretty much got the entire Southeast. They're going to be the ones that are going to be growing their transplants for you if you buy them at the store. And they do a good job, but you're also limited to whatever varieties they have. By controlling that, and ordering seed, now you can grow your own transplants. And I think the key with this is just make sure you have plenty of light, whether you have one of these special grower lights and setups like you see down in that right hand corner of the slide, or on the left side there, kind of a small micro baby greenhouse, or maybe you're doing it in a cold frame. I don't think they're real difficult to grow. Certainly things like for the spring garden, you definitely want to have transplants when it comes to tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, the solanaceous crops. They do much better, and they don't do very well if you just try to start them in the garden as a seed. There are other things that you'll see in the garden center that are started from seed grown into transplants. And I don't really think you need to mess with that. I mean, everything in the cucurbic line, and you're starting to see Bonnie's now putting out cucumbers and squash. I've even seen okra and sweet corn. And it's just kind of crazy to really spend the money on a transplant for that when that can so easily germinate, directly in the garden itself. Okay, next. All right, don't have to tell you folks this, but just as a reminder, maybe it's been a little while since you ran a soil sample or did any type of liming or checking your soil, but let's just make sure we've got that pH adjusted properly. I can't tell you how many times I go out to a site, including quite a few commercial gardens, and when we finally get back to pH, we find out one or two things. Either it is drastically low and those plants are not utilizing the nutrition that they need, or in some cases, they've never run a soil test, but they have limed excessively every single year, which is just as bad as being too acidic. When you drive that pH over 7 into the high 7s or close to 8, same thing happens. You begin to lock up the essential nutrients the plant needs, and some other things that are quite toxic to the plant become available. Okay, next. All right. We get eager as it warms up. Today's actually not a bad day. I thought it was going to rain. We know we're going to get through this cold front, and then eventually we're going to kind of get to the time where we can plant. But I like to emphasize this because I see it done all the time where folks will get out into that bed. It's still a little damp. Maybe you've got a small tractor and you can really see the tractor mud sticking to the tires, or you're walking along and you kind of hear it squish. That's a terrible time to be in the garden. We don't want to compact those soils. We want them to have a lot of aeration. So wait till you can basically, feel like that soil moisture is maybe down around 20 or 30%. Take a handful of soil. We've mentioned this before in programs, squeeze it together. If you can poke it with your finger and it breaks apart into small little kind of modules, that's perfect. That's about what you want to see in the garden. But if your finger sticks into it like Play-Doh and it stays in shape, that's too wet to work the soil. Go ahead. Some of you folks are probably familiar with this, and maybe you're not, but we have a great resource at the University of Georgia. It's our weather stations all across the state. This GeorgiaWeather.net has got just a plethora of information. One of the things we really want to see is the soil temperatures when it comes to vegetables. You can also see the history of rainfall and everything else you wanted to dream of, relative humidity and so forth. But when you go on the site, if you've never been before, there'll be a map of the state, and then you'll just click on the closest location to where you live. It might not be the exact city you're in, but it'll be close enough. That first page that comes up, if you kind of scroll down, you'll start seeing a lot of information, one of which is the soil temperatures. And what we're looking for this spring garden is we really want to see those soil temperatures consistently hitting 65 degrees or more. And right now, looking across, some of the things I checked on that map, we're still in the 50s or 55 degrees, 58 degrees, depending on where you look. And that's just too cool for most vegetables. Granted, you could get in there and plant potatoes and some other things right now, even a second round of winter crops. But if you try to put tomatoes and peppers and those things in the ground in the 50s, you're going to have a lot of trouble. So let's wait till we start seeing 65 or high 60s on the soil temperatures, and that'll be the key that, hey, it might be a good time to plant. When is that going to happen? You know how the weather is. It's hard to predict. But I would say we're probably looking at least towards the middle of April for a good planting time. Go ahead. So maybe you used a cover crop. We certainly have out here in our garden. It's a great way to kind of hold the soil, and then as you're tilling it in, it's adding back organic matter. Well, I would say as soon as you can work the soil and it's not too wet, go ahead and shovel it in, till it in if you've got a tiller or a tractor-mounted tiller if it's a large size, and begin to terminate it. You want to kind of have all that green growth tilled in the soil and broken down before you go to plant. It'll certainly make it easier to work the soil once it's kind of biodegraded, and all the nutrient value and whatever fertility value there's into that will begin to release once it kind of decomposes. So this is what we're working on right now at several sites. Is we're tilling on our cover crop. We're just now getting ready to prepare for spring planting. Okay. I really like to emphasize the use of raised beds, particularly if you're working with some new gardeners that you might be helping and they're not sure, don't have a lot of equipment. I think raised beds would be a great way to start. As you know, you've been probably through the class. We don't advise against using treated lumber. There's certainly other products that you can use to build with, but we find no danger in using treated lumber at all. The only time you couldn't use it, I always make this distinction, is if you were an organic grower that was selling your produce as certified organic. So that's the only exception. Or there's also another thing called certified naturally grown, where you would not use treated lumber. But those are basically for sale operations where they're selling their produce and they go under a type of regulation and inspection. Other than that, as a homeowner, master gardener, treated wood's fine, but there's other things you can use. Actually, I had a call this morning about someone wanting to know if they had some old, kind of rusty old tin roof and want to know if they laid it sideways and kind of held it up, could they make a raised bed out of that? And I said, sure, that'd be great. I've seen some really nice raised beds made out of old tin. Shouldn't be a problem at all with that. So it's a great way. What are the advantages? You probably already know. It actually warms up a little bit quicker than the outside soil temperature. So you might get your plants in a week early. Sometimes, you don't have a lot of equipment. So raised bed, once you get it built, you don't even have to have a tiller. You can do it with hand shovels. Certainly the weed control when you start off with is normally easier because a lot of times using a lot of bagged amendments. So, there are certain advantages. The main disadvantage besides, it's a little bit pricey up front, particularly if you're buying treated lumber, that's expensive. Is the fact that they drain so well. That's an advantage, but also a disadvantage. You don't normally have drainage issues, but because that drainage is so good, oftentimes you're going to have to water more than if you had a traditional in the ground garden. In fact, I've seen some raised beds that drain so well, they had to virtually water about every other day. Okay. How are you going to irrigate them or any garden? You've probably heard this already, but at the end of the day, we really like the drip systems where we can keep the water or possibly soaker hoses down near the base, not wet the foliage. It's just a really cool way to water. It looks like at first when you turn it on, nothing's happening, and then slowly that wet area bleeds out around the root system. It's way more efficient. In fact, you're going to use at least 50% less water by using some type of drip system or soaker type system. If you're helping someone to develop one, just remember if it's a drip system, you're really going to want some type of filter on there and possibly a pressure regulator to kind of cut that pressure down. These things only run at about 10 psi or so, whereas a sprinkler head, just putting out full force, that's running closer to probably 30 to 50 psi. So drip irrigation is a great way to do it, and you can do it on raised beds as well. You can buy elbows and where you don't trip over the wires and bring them up and down and so forth. So many different ways to do that. I buy most of my drip system online. I go to a place called Drip Works or another place called Drip Depot, kind of like Home Depot, but Drip Depot. And there are other places as well that are out there, and you can buy complete kits. But I think it's the ideal way to water vegetables. Okay. Weed control is always a major issue. It is something I've actually done a lot of research on over the years and try to look at the best scenarios. If you don't have weeds in your first year, even in raised bed, you're probably going to get them eventually. They're just in the air blowing around. The birds are depositing them, or they come into some of the soil that you might have purchased. And so you got to look at a way to protect them. Certainly mulch is one option. Either composted wood chips. I don't like fresh wood chips, but some that are composted. Even pine straw, the acidity factor won't be a big issue on vegetables as quick as they are. Using some type of wheat straw that's clean is a good option for weed control and moisture. We use a lot of weed fabric, which is like in the middle picture. It's a permeable fabric where moisture and fertilizer can go through, but it blocks out the weeds, and it seems to work very well. I've also done some studies where we've done strip cropping. And if you look actually on the lower left and the lower right, those are the same places. Basically, we had a good cover crop in the winter. We tilled down some centers, and then I mowed down the cover crop, but left it in place. And that gave us a place to walk. It sort of blocked out the weeds, and we almost had like more of a conventional tillage in the center there. It was a pretty effective way to grow vegetables, and it helped hold the soil, and it actually looked attractive. And then, of course, top right up there, there are chemical options. There are some pre-emergent herbicides out there. And then depending on the vegetable you're growing, they're post-emergent that you could apply after the fact. Just have to be real careful you're using the right product. The one thing I will say is every year I get pictures of, particularly tomatoes are real sensitive, that have got Roundup injury, glyphosate. And a lot of times folks will swear, well, we didn't spray any Roundup in our vegetable garden, but they may have been, 50 yards away spraying around flower beds. And if just a few little droplets happen to blow in a mist and get on the tomato plants, it will affect them. So be real careful about which herbicide you're using and how close to that garden you are if they're not, going to be conducive to your plants. Okay. We do like to plant beneficial flowers in our gardens. We've done a few studies on this. And, it's not a matter of you hear people say, oh, yeah, I heard marigolds, plant those in the garden and all the bugs will stay away. No, it doesn't work like that. I think it's more of an attraction. I think with the beneficials like zinnias and marigolds and colorful flowers, you're bringing in a lot of good pollinators, but you're also attracting beneficial insects. The one down in the right, that's buckwheat. And we always plant a few stands of buckwheat. It's a fast growing summer annual. It's not real showy in per se color, but it's got a prolific white bloom that is highly attractive to honeybees and other pollinators, as well as some predatory beneficial insects. So yeah, have at least one bed, one area where you're going to put some color attractor out there. That's sort of calling in the good guys. And I think it's kind of a good security for your garden. Okay. Poor pollination is something that we see early in the season. Sometimes, we get cooler temperatures or overcast, and the pollinators just don't fly much. And it's not just honeybees, because they're only a small percentage of what actually pollinates your garden. There's all kinds of different midge wasps and other type bees that do pollination. If they're, not having the weather to fly in, you could get some poorly pollinated plants, which means they're not 100% unpollinated, but they're just partially pollinated. Then you get some funny shaped fruit like the cucumber. The corn, you have to realize the silk that comes out, that is where the pollen from the tassel up top is going to go to. It's primarily wind pollinated. If any one of those silks does not get completely pollinated, or that silk gets removed from the plant, you're going to lose a kernel on that ear of corn right there. And so when you start seeing corn like that, that just means that silk was somehow damaged, didn't get pollinated, or was removed. And you're going to get kind of a pretty lousy looking piece of corn. So poor pollination, not a lot we can do sometimes about the weather, but certainly, we want to take care when we're spraying insecticides that we're not knocking out pollinators. We already talked about attracting them with the colorful flowers, but any type of pesky insects that we are going to spray, even if it's organic products, I would hold off till late in the evening when everything kind of is subsided, and then you can make some direct sprays to the pesky insects then. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah. So speaking of insects, they're coming, and sometimes they get here pretty quick. And just looking down the line here, what we've got is, we've got that wasp-looking little bug is actually going to create the one to the right of it, and that's a squash vine borer. That's the female, and she's actually a moth, not a wasp. And she'll fly around and she'll sting the base of cucurbits, and that being anything from cucumbers, a lot of yellow squash, zucchinis, and she'll deposit an egg, and that egg hatches, and that little larva goes right in the plant and tunnels away. So it's very difficult sometimes to even know you have this pest until you see the plant start to flop over. Squash vine bugs, also the leaf-footed bug there, going to be real prevalent, particularly as we start really heating up this summer. You're going to see more and more damage on your plants. So how do we control them? Well, everything from using chemical controls, man-made chemical controls, and timely applications in the evening, like we mentioned. I always try to start off with the organic controls first, using some of the naturally occurring products like neem oil or BT, which is a kind of a caterpillar type control, or pyrethrin. Exclusion, trap crops are another thing we've talked about in the past. Exclusion, using some type of netting over your plants. You can do that as long as you can allow either pollinators to get in, or you can lift those up and pollinate them. The cucurbits, the squashes, the cucumbers, the watermelon, the pumpkins need insect pollination. Well, if you want to keep a net over them, you can, but you're going to have to pollinate them. And you can do that on a small scale. If you want to take a Q-tip or even pull off the male bloom and swirl it inside the female bloom, and the female bloom is going to have a small fruit behind it. That's how you can identify it, the oval. You're going to pollinate it every single day for several days. You can actually create kind of a bug-free environment and still get a really good harvest, because you're artificially pollinating it. We've done that before and have had great results. On a large scale, it could get time consuming. Trap crops are just, it's planting something that's attractive to the pesty guys to kind of lure them away. Some examples that we've used in the past have been sunflowers can be highly attractive to stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs. You let them get all over on the sunflowers and then you can spray the heck out of them. For squash vine bugs and borers, we have used what's called blue Hubbard squash. It's a large growing winter squash that you plant in the summertime, highly attractive to those pesty insects. Another one is sorghum. Not many people are real familiar with grain sorghum, but it's another one that's extremely attractive to the leaf-footed bug. So those are some options. We've got a really good publication if you go to Georgia Extension Publications on trap cropping, and most of what we're talking about here on some different ways to control pest and squash and other type things. So everything we talk about, more than likely, either I or someone have written a publication on. You should be able to find it. Okay. So that's, I didn't realize it was ended. So that's kind of just a real quick overview of what to look for. And I think just to summarize, let's make sure the garden soil moisture is correct before we get in there and start doing our tilling. If it is, it's a great time now to kind of start preparing the garden by tilling, maybe soil testing, adding lime or not if we need to. Certainly we want to wait for the soil temperatures, monitor that by looking at the website, and wait till we get in about 65 degrees or so. Right now, you can still start transplants. We've got transplants in the greenhouse, but we've actually got some we still haven't even planted yet. And I really like to do what's called successive planting. I like to plant every few weeks a little bit more of a variety so that I have different age groups. And that way, over the course of the time, I can continue to harvest. And even if the older ones are getting inundated by a problem, I've got the younger crop that's coming on. So I really highly recommend maybe staggering your planting times. That way you'll kind of benefit from a season-long harvest, particularly if it's something like sweet corn. You don't want to plant it all in one shot and then there it is. It's nice to eat that all across the summertime. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. I know we didn't have a whole lot of time, but hopefully maybe you got a few questions that we triggered.
Yeah, Bob, we've actually got several questions coming into the chat box. So that was great. Thank you so much for your discussion. Yep. I'm just going to go ahead and start with the first question that came in. There's the first couple ones are about irrigation in the garden. Okay. Jenny asked, should a backflow valve be considered on irrigation lines?
Yeah, so that's a great question. A backflow valve basically prevents water from going back into the source. And I think that's always a good idea, particularly if you're doing something like we do, running like liquid fertilizers through the drip irrigation system or anything really. Some people will use like a hose end sprayer and put herbicides or other sprays and chemicals out. So I think that, yeah, that's a great idea to have some type of a backflow preventer. And it's just a small little device that don't cost much. And it usually goes on right out after where the source of the water is. It'll go on first. And it just basically disallows water from sucking back up through almost a siphon system into the water supply. And in most cases, we're talking like a home well or something like that. So good point. And yes, I would recommend it.
Okay, great. And the next question is for soaker hoses. Do you put them on top of the ground or slightly under the top of the soil?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So soaker hoses are a little bit more forgiving. You can even lightly cover them with soil and they'll still bleed out water. The drip system that I showed in this program primarily, those drip lines are not very tolerant of weight. So the drip lines are really thin. If you get much soil on them, they'll quit working. So you want to keep them on top. But soaker hoses themselves, they can either be on top of the ground or slightly under, and they'll still function pretty well. The only thing I've seen on soaker hoses you have to be careful of is running too long a length. When you start to get over about 100 or 150 feet in soaker hoses, you start to lose pressure towards the end of it. So that's something to kind of keep in mind.
Okay, and now changing topics. The next question is, can you discuss companion planting?
Okay, so companion planting in a simplistic answer are planting things that would be very compatible next to each other. In some cases, people believe one kind of helps prevent disease, insects. Other people say, hey, this one's just conducive because it's like a nitrogen producing legume, and there's a nitrogen utilizing plant right next to it. we have tried all combinations, and even though you'll see lots of literature on it, I'm not overly convinced it's that important here in Georgia. I think crop rotation, rotating our families of vegetables from one area and hopefully keeping them out of that area for at least 3 years is a better idea. The other thing I'd say on companion planting, I like to look at it like this. I am a proponent of, hey, if I've got a high nitrogen using plant, for instance, something like tomatoes or sweet corn, I would love to put that in a place where I had a legume crop, and the legume is a nitrogen fixing plant, such as beans, or maybe it's the winter cover crop of winter peas. Once I till that into the soil, there's probably a 30% nitrogen gain that I can utilize and cut down on my fertilizer bill. So that's a type of companion planting I really like to see, is where we can utilize that nutrition. But as far as, this plant being next to that one and everything doing better, I just have not seen enough evidence to buy into that.
Okay, thank you, Bob. And then we've got a couple more questions here in the chat, and I'll go ahead and read those off. Karen is asking about how to protect blueberries with the freezing temperatures coming this weekend.
That's a good question. So the blueberries right now are very vulnerable. I'm seeing peaches in bloom and so forth. It kind of depends on how full that bloom is. Some of the buds are swelled up right now, may make it through. If they're beginning to crack open, they could certainly have damage. And it depends on how sustained that cold will be. From what I'm seeing, it's going to get super cold, but it's not going to like last for days. It's going to kind of warm up during the daytime. On a large commercial scale, if it was a blueberry farm, they would probably go as far as to start running irrigation on it, believe it or not. And they will actually freeze all the branches on the plant. And I know that sounds like it would make it colder, but it actually insulates the plants and it warms them up. For a homeowner type scenario, hey, if you got a few plants and you're worried about them and they're not overly large, if you could somehow maybe even build a little structure around them, like take some T-posts or wooden posts, put them in the ground and wrap it in plastic, that would make enough temperature difference possibly to keep those plants warm. Even piling some mulch up around the base of that plant might give them a little bit more security. But when it comes to, Mother Nature and trying to protect from cold, it's really a difficult call. And best case scenario is, even if you get damaged, you're not going to lose the entire crop. Just maybe some of the vulnerable blooms will be taken out, and you'll still have others for production. But that's a good question, and it's not a real easy answer, particularly on a homeowner scale.
Okay, and our next question is about raised beds. And Beth asked, what are your thoughts on using cinder blocks for raised beds? Any problem with leaching from the cement?
Yeah, so if you're familiar with cement products, anything, like your foundation, your house or whatever, it's made with cement, and cement is a combination. The mortar has lime in it. So lime, as we already talked about, is a agent that can actually raise the pH. That is normally builder's lime inside there, which is a fast acting lime, but it doesn't last long. So here's my point. If you've got cinder blocks that have been sitting around a long time, most of that builder's lime is probably already leached out of them, and you're not going to see any appreciable difference. If you use some fresh cinder blocks and built the bed, I honestly don't think by the time you filled in that soil, there's going to be enough of an exchange of that lime to make a huge difference. The exception would be if I was growing something like blueberries that really wanted a super acidic soil, I might shy away from using them. But if these are to some extent a weathered cinder block, or even if it was a brand new one, by the time you start piling in, because a cinder block, depending on which way you sit it, could be easily 6 to 8 inches tall. By the time you fill that thing up with soil, any pH raising ability of that, which may actually be beneficial depending on your soil, is not going to have any real, in my opinion, any real bad effect on your vegetables.
Okay, that's good to know. And then we've got a couple more questions here.
Okay.
Linda says she lives in Tortuga County, so North Georgia, and she wants to grow artichokes using young plants from California. Is this just a dream? She says.
Yeah. So artichokes can be quite sensitive. I do know people that do grow them. I'm not 100% sure what varieties. And as we know, California is kind of a wonderful state for growing a lot of things. They have a rather mild climate. They don't deal with the humidity that we have and so forth. So artichokes can be grown here. I really don't know enough to tell you that the specific variety that you have would do well. Certainly, though, you are going to want to protect it as best as you can. It might be something if you can plant it in somewhat of a microclimate that gets protected from any kind of north winds, keep the cool breezes off of it, and maybe kind of, protect it as much as you can when the temperature's going down. You might get it to go, but it's kind of like an iffy plant. Kind of comes along the lines of when people try to grow things like olives in Georgia. It can be done, but it's not always easy. So certainly I'd give it a try. It can't hurt to do that, but just know that there'll be some challenges.
Okay, and Karen asked, how do I keep the deer out?
Well, I have that same problem, Karen, and the only way I have done it, I've tried everything from plastic netting to different types of repellents, and the only thing that honestly worked is when we fenced it off. I've got some 8-foot metal fencing that's pretty stout fencing, goes all the way around. I've got several kind of areas I can enter in with my tractor or whatever. But really, the repellents are only temporary. We've tried all different kinds. Some people actually use electric fencing. Some people have coated the electric fence in peanut butter to get them to lick it and kind of shock them. But at the end of the day, if you've got a bad deer problem, it's very difficult to grow the vegetables without basically using some type of exclusion. And it doesn't just have to be an ugly looking, chain link fence. You certainly can use creativity. I've seen some really nice, almost gazebo style type buildings that were built around the garden, even though it was exposed on top for sunlight. But you're going to really have to be looking in terms of about something 7 foot tall. Anything under 7 foot, 6 foot, whatever, a deer can come right over the top of it. They're amazing in what they can do on jumping. So that's going to be my suggestion primarily. Everything else I think is going to be blowing in the wind. Everything from scare tactics to repellents. It'll be temporary, but they'll get there. They'll get in there unless you keep them out, with fencing.
Okay. And then Betty says that she can't find Athens or Clark County on georgiaweather.net, but there are stations in Watkinsville, which is right there next to it. So that information from those weather stations should be sufficient. Is that correct, Bob?
That would be
No.
close enough. Yeah,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, not a problem with that.
Okay, well, that is all of the questions in the chat. Does anybody have a question they want to ask? Anything else? Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions into the chat, and I don't see anybody unmuting themselves. So let's see what else we have here. Thank you so much, Bob. We really appreciate your time today and just all the information that you share and all the questions that you answered. It's always good to have you join us for these sessions. And I know that we all always learn something, even if it is just a refresher. And we did end up with 70+ people online. So it's great to have a good crowd for this.
Wow, it's a big crowd. I didn't realize that many.
Yeah, a great crowd. And we do record these too, and we share it for anybody who is not able to attend the live Zoom session. And so just speaking of Zoom sessions, we'll continue these Thoughtful Thursday series for the rest of the year. We have them monthly through November, and they are usually 2 to 2:30, and we do post the archives in MG Log for you guys. And so you can watch any and all of the Thoughtful Thursday sessions through your MG Log accounts. And the presentations, like I just said, they're recorded. They're here right on your homepage. There's a nice little video thumbnail there for you to access them. We did recently release the 8th edition of our Georgia Master Gardener Handbook. It has 36 chapters. It's a full color book. It has more than 300 photos, and there is still a Master Gardener discount code for ordering the 8th edition of the handbook. So if you want one and you are a veteran master gardener and you have one of the previous editions of the handbook, you can purchase the handbook with a discount, and your agent has that ordering information, and I have it as well. So if you are looking for that, looking to get a book, just let us know. Our next Thoughtful Thursday session, we will have one on April 14th. And we will talk about celebrating Georgia Master Gardeners. April is, we have National Volunteer Appreciation Week during the month of April. So we'll focus on that topic. In May, Dr. Waltz will join us to talk about spring turf greenup. And then in June, we will have a plant pathology update from Dr. Elizabeth Little. So that's all that we have for today. I don't see any more questions for Bob. So thank you again, Bob, for your time. We just really appreciate it. And it's just been a great afternoon being online with all of you guys. And if you have any questions or need anything, just shoot me an email. I'll put it in the chat box for you. Otherwise, I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thank you, Sarah, for helping me through with all the technology. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you, Bob. I appreciate it.
Okay. You have a good one.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.